We now move on to the second stage, the mirror stage. And the mirror stage is, for Lacan, it's quite a significant part of his work, and it is what gave Lacan a lot of prominence in the world of psychology, and something that the APA did not really appreciate, and they did not appreciate Lacan. In fact, they did not want him to be any part of the IPA, the International Psychological Association. Okay. So the mirror stage is, it's generally between 6 and 18 months. It could be a little earlier, it could be a little later, and everybody is different, and there is no, there absolutely is no barrier which occurs in 1 second, and over which we cross at a certain time, identical time. Everybody differs, and for some of us it could be as early as 3 months, 4 months, others it could be much later, and in fact for those with some sort of physical damage to the body, it happens much later, if at all. However, generally between 6 and 18 months, it happens. So during this mirror stage, what happens? One day, the baby, and the metaphor here is, and the reality of the thing is that one day the baby sees itself. Until then, it didn't see itself, it didn't know it existed. It thought that, well, I'm the food source, and the food source is me, and that's about it. Mom is I, and I am Mom. But then one day it sees itself, it looks at itself, looks at its hand, looks at its body, it says, hang on, what's this that we have here? There's something here that we have. So it sees itself, and it sees itself, it sees a reflection of itself. It looks in the mirror and sees itself. And the famous experiment conducted was the baby and the chimpanzee, where it took a baby and a chimpanzee and put them in front of a mirror, and the chimpanzee did not look at itself, did not care, whereas the baby did. The baby looked in the mirror and said, hang on, something's going on here. There's somebody who, it looks like me, or could be me, this thing called me, and is moving as I move. If I raise my arm, my right arm, and move it this way, then this thing I'm looking at is also doing exactly the same thing. Isn't that interesting? Says the baby. And according to Lacan, the baby looks at itself, and not only looks at itself, but looks at a wonderful of itself. A wonderful aspect of itself, which is the whole thing. It says, wow, look at me, I'm great. This was what Lacan called the ideal I. The baby looks at itself and says, it's ideal. It's ideal for what I need, and for who I am, it's really ideal. But at the same time, the baby has these two distinctly different attitudes towards itself, and these are hatred and love. The hatred is, of course, that I hate this version of myself because it's better than I, it's better than me, it's better than me. But at the same time, I desire to be like that image. And that becomes love. The ideal I represents a simplified, bounded self. Until then, the baby was not coherent. It wasn't together, it wasn't. But suddenly, when the baby sees itself, it thinks, there I am. And there I am, and I am somebody who is something, somebody who can do. Okay. It importantly represents a simplified, bounded self, which is not chaotic, as it sees itself in infancy. It's not chaotic. Suddenly, and in fact, it's not like it previously saw itself as chaotic, said, I'm chaotic, I should become non-chaotic and whole and cohesive. It just didn't realize anything until one day it realized. Then, when it realizes, then suddenly there is coherence. Prior to its realization of coherence, there was no realization at all. So it's like you're walking around in the dark and you've never seen light, and then suddenly you see light and you see everything. Prior to this, you didn't walk around in the dark thinking, I'm in the dark. You just walked around not knowing that you were in the dark because there was dark. And then suddenly there's light, and let there be light, said the passage, and there was light and everything came into being. Lacan tells us that to characterize the ego, there is a misrecognition or a méconnaissance, which means to see the ideal I where there is really a fragmented body. And as a consequence, there is a characterization of the ego. And in this way, the baby creates an ideal self, and this motivates a sort of narcissism and narcissistic fantasies in developing itself as a subject. And this becomes an imaginary order, okay? An order of things where the baby sees itself as quite good, quite handsome, and quite pretty, or quite good looking in its very unnecessarily handsome position, because a baby doesn't need to be handsome or pretty or cute. Babies are small and quite cute, irrespective of what they look like and so forth. Everybody kind of likes babies and likes to pick them up and hug them and everything. And so it's a very narcissistic way of looking at things. So the baby really idealizes itself, and this emerges from the fact that prior to this there was nothing. It's a novelty. If we look at the first diagram, we see that we have our own body, and our own body is separated into two. The beautiful ideal I and the horrible ideal I, where the beautiful ideal I is mediated by a love for self, whereas the horrible ideal I, the jealousy aspect, is the mediator for that. If we look at the second diagram, where we have a misrecognition of the fragmented body for I, we see that the ego character emerges as a signified as we misrecognize our fragment body for an I, and that develops an ego character. We're always going to be fragmented, and according to religion and religious precept, there's always going to be fragmentation, and that's what we must keep working at all the time. So if we look at the third diagram, we see the signifier on the left, which represents the ideal I, and the ideal I signifies to two different fantasies, the narcissistic fantasy 1 and narcissistic fantasy 2. And the mediation there is, of course, the ego. So the signified aspects of this sign emerge as a sort of narcissism that becomes an imaginary order of things. Narcissism is, of course, an illusion or an illusionary process. So the ways in which we see ourselves are always illusion, they're always a signified, they're never an object or as the object is. Now, the baby which stops identifying with the food source, with the breasts of its mother, but is aware of its difference and the difference between itself and others, and it sees its reflection, and it starts to recognize that there is something there, something that's quite attractive, and it's aware of some kind of otherness, views itself, it's seen itself. Okay, it's seen that something exists, and that thing that exists is its own self, but its own image as well. Okay, so it identifies with its own image and with the object of desire of others. It says, well, if I think that I'm good looking, if I'm really good looking, and if I think that I'm attractive, then I must be attractive to people. I must be attractive to the people around me. There's Auntie blah 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 who teaches me how to use my toy truck, or there's Uncle blah 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 who make funny sounds or funny faces with their funny shapes with their faces. So these people must like me. They must think that I'm very attractive in some way or another. So it identifies with its own image, and it identifies with the fact that it's an object of desire for others or of others. And this Lacan called a kind of libidinal dynamism, a libidinal dynamism. It is this moment of the mirror stage in an infant that marks the primordial recognition of oneself as I. It sees an idealization of something that was previously incoherent, and then the identification of itself as an I begins. It is a primordial recognition of itself as a coherent whole body of thought, of emotion, of many things. This recognition of itself as an I happens before there's an objectification in the dialectic of identification with the other, the big other or the small other or the other, and before language. This is prior, now remember, this is prior to language becoming a part of the baby's life. The language has not become a part of the baby's life. The baby cannot do language. It cannot do language. So this happens before language restores to it in the universal, universally its function as a subject. So all this is prior to the baby becoming a subject. It's still in the pre-subject stage. There's no language, the baby cannot do language. The baby certainly isn't able to do much at all. And the moment it falls into language, the moment the baby begins to fall into language, as Lacan says, the moment it falls into language, it stops seeing itself as an ideal I, says Lacan. It recognizes it has no name, no identity, no name, no identity, and it assumes the name of the father, which we will discuss very soon, the name of the father. So then there is a transition, but that's still far away. The baby is still, around a year old or so, and still an ideal aspect of itself, an ideal image of itself. Okay, so the mirror stage is definitely necessary for the next stage. Without the CD, the digital speed and the digital purpose and power of the CD, we wouldn't have been able to then gain enough momentum to get into the MP3 stage. So, CDs were, though obsolete now, pretty much obsolete. I don't know anyone who still uses CDs, although I've seen them in record stores and stuff. They were very necessary for our development, without which we wouldn't have gotten to where we are now. So in the mirror stage, there's a sidetrack for me, very Derridian sidetrack, sidetracking in a post-structuralist way. The mirror stage was necessary, said Lacan, for the next stage. We cannot just jump up from the infant stage to the big other stage. We need the central stage, which is the mirror stage, says Lacan. Okay, because the infant recognizing itself as an I parallels recognizing the self as an other, vis-a-vis other people. It's a self-alienating act. You have to recognize the whole before you recognize that there are separations. There is a separation between wholes or amongst wholes. You cannot recognize separation unless you identify the object first, the whole object. You cannot develop a digital MP3 without actually learning about what it is to digitize something with a CD, hardware. Okay, so that's what Lacan was moving towards, and he told us that first we need to identify the I, and then we identify that the I separates from others. Okay, like an onion. If you think of an onion, the onion needs to first form one cell before it separates a cell. Without forming a cell, it cannot separate the cell into an increasing number of cells. Okay, it first needs to form one cell, and then there's separation. So Lacan tells us that the recognition of the self's image precedes language. Okay, so we cannot do language, says Lacan. We cannot until we begin to form that first image, that one whole, which we then separate from others, and we get difference. So we cannot get difference. We cannot get the difference which is fundamental to the structural view of language without an object. Okay. First, we need an object so we can separate and bound, and then cause some sort of different system. The subject understands the place of the image of the self within a social order, where the subject negotiates its social relationships with others. So there's the onion, then we separate the cells and we get the multiple cells and the onion grows, and so forth. Now we move on to the third stage, the 18 months to 4 years. And again, it's not precisely 18 months. It could be less, could be more, and for some it may even be never, if there's been physical damage to the body. However, it's, on average between 18 months to 4 years. And this is the third stage, the stage within which we see the big other occurring. So what happens here? What is the big issue that happens here? And of course, actually, it's prior to 18 months. It's, for some it's 12 months or 10 months even, What happens here? What is the big thing, the big event here? The big event is the sudden, and I sudden in inverted commas, acquisition, incorporation of language into the body, the development of the competence to use language. This is the big change in the body of the infant. So in the process of developing a competence to use language, there's an increase in separation between the subject and its connection to the real. Okay. There's an increase in separation between the subject and the real, and it severs its connection. So there is no longer a real, a materiality according to Lacan. And this real is, of course, there, but it's not there. It's not connected to the infant. It's not there. And if you look at the diagram, we see that the language development mediates a great separation from the ideal I, between the ideal I and materiality or the real. So the surroundings are signified as materiality, the own body is signified as an ideal I, and the language develops this mediatory process. So the sign articulation, as we said before, increases where the separation distance is directly proportional to language development. So everything increases directly proportional to the development of competence in language in the infant. Now, if you recall the Saussurean description of language, structuralism from Saussure, which we haven't looked at structuralism, but we've looked at the semiotic aspects of Saussure, which we'll look at structuralism soon, very soon when we have that talk, that meeting. We see that the language system has meaning, takes meaning through its own internal differences, according to Saussure. Things are not unless there is something else, there is something different. For example, when Lacan tells us that the word father only makes sense in terms of other terms. It is defined with or against. Okay, so father doesn't exist until we see a mother. Then we make the comparison and say, yes, I see now what father means. Before I didn't see it because you didn't tell me there was a mother, but now I see what mother is. Or the opposite, mother, I see what mother is now because, there's father. I get to draw the contours around mother because there's father now and there's sister. I didn't get it before because I didn't see the other side of things. Okay. What's that movie, The Maze Runner, where, they cannot get the maze until they get out. They have to get out of the maze before they understand the complexity and the vastness of the maze. I think there's a few episodes there, and I've seen one of them, not the first one. I think I've seen a few down the line, and I've seen something else, another series which is quite similar or something, but quite interesting. Now, from this, Lacan goes on to tell us that the signifier father finds signification. It becomes a sign in relation to other signifiers. The phallus, authority, appropriation, legitimacy, mother, son. There's a whole cluster of, or several clusters of signifiers and signifieds which together position the word father so for us to get its meaning, So sooner or later, we gradually develop, increase our conception of the word father. All signifiers, says Lacan, all signifiers, working together as a system, operate irrespective of materiality, i.e. the real. So irrespective of materiality, the signifiers work together as a system in this stage, the third stage of the baby's development, says Lacan. Okay, let's look at this diagram now. And at the top we see that there is a language artifact. If there's one artifact, there's one thing, one word, and there is no other artifact, then there's no relation. There is no signified and no signifier. There's nothing. So, as we said before, that language doesn't come one element at a time. It comes all at once. Otherwise, there is no language. Language can only happen if all of language suddenly appears. Of course, the articulation of language by the baby improves and strengthens, but language happens all at once. Otherwise, language does not exist. If we look below the line, we see that the language system, where there's a signified and a signifier of the different language elements, the language system operates outside of the real. It doesn't operate with the real. And there's a systemic barrier between the real and the language system. Now, we're going on to discuss materiality and the real in terms of how it connects to this stage of development of the infant. The differential system of language, and Saussure did discuss extensively the differential system of language, determines the perception of the world, because once you begin to differentiate between elements of language and you articulate the world, of course, that's quite obvious. You don't know a table until you know things around it, the chair or the desk or the shelves or something. And then you begin to articulate how the world works by labeling, identifying these things linguistically. Okay. So, but when, according to Lacan, once we get into our post-mirror stage phase, the intrusion of the materiality of the real becomes very traumatic for the baby, for the infant, for the child. By acquiring language, by getting language elements. Now, you cannot acquire language because you need to develop it. You need to be active. Activity theory, according to Vygotsky. But we mean by acquiring language elements. Okay, by getting these language elements, by getting them in some way or another, the subject enters what Lacan calls the symbolic order. Because it's language, according to Lacan, which symbolizes everything. It's language. Without language, whatever language means, then we cannot symbolize. The subject becomes an empty signifier. When the subject acquires language elements and starts to get language, the subject becomes an empty signifier, says Lacan. An empty signifier, an I, within the field of the other, okay. It becomes an empty signifier within the field of the other. So there's only signification once we start to make the comparison. There's nothing there, says Lacan, until we find the situation and we make the situated signification. In this other, what is the other? According to Lacan, it's a delocalized system, delocalized cultural or language system, according to Lacan. Okay. So, this linguistic, socio-cultural and linguistic positioning of the I only after which there is signification, and without which there is no signification, is marked by gender differentials. And gender, of course, is very, very important, and it's something that we discuss way down the line when we speak about Michel Foucault and Judith Butler and everything, you know, queer theory and everything else. You know, we discuss that, but much later on. Okay, so this articulation happens through the marked aspect of gender. You know, what does gender mean? And gender is definitely not what you tick when you go through the airport. It says male or female, what is your gender? That is not gender, of course. That is sex. And, you know, now there are variations to that in many countries. There's an acceptance of the fact that there exist more than two sexes. The actions of the infant in the symbolic stage, where there is symbolic order, the actions of the infant are determined by positioned sex types, positioned gender types, and the like. So in the language system, there's male and female, and they're understood relatively. You know, if there was only male, or if the infant, or if we knew only male, we weren't aware of female, then we wouldn't get the order of things. Obviously, we wouldn't get the order of things. But because we know both male and female, we get the order of things, and we get male. If we didn't get female, then we wouldn't be able to get male. If we look at the diagram now, we see something that initially looks a little complex, but we begin with the top left. We have the ideal I, and the ideal I is an empty signifier until it becomes signified as a subject within the field of the other. And then that becomes a signifier itself and becomes resignified into another field of the other, or a field of another other, or another field of another, and there's a gradual increase in semiotic potential of the subject. So the subject, by moving from field to field, develops its own semiotic potential. So if we go to the next diagram, we see that the individual, by experiencing this gender and sex positioning, then they become signified and develop their signification and become signified into the various aspects of who they are. So if we look at the next diagram, we see two different representations. The top one, of course, is the signified basic representation, and we have at the top level, we have the instance of our own body. Within our own body, we have our body, but that through some sort of mediation, we see an idealized version of our body, which becomes a signified. And this is in the mirror stage. But then in the third stage, the symbolic stage, we see that where there are surroundings, and the surroundings, the big other, mediate the process, our body, ourselves, becomes placed within a certain social order, which is always moving, of course, always fluctuating, always changing, but it's an order nonetheless.